Hi, my name is Jay Kelly, and I'm with F5. And here with me is Ryan Johnson, F5's Manager of Solutions Engineering for U.S. Federal and System Integrators.
Hello, everyone.
We're here to discuss the recent executive order from the White House on how to improve the nation's cybersecurity and how this executive order, while being directed at federal government departments and agencies, really is applicable and should be applied to any business, anywhere, regardless if they deal with the federal government or if they're even not U.S.-based. This executive order states that the U.S. faces persistent and increasingly sophisticated malicious cyber campaigns that threaten the public sector, the private sector, and ultimately the American people's security and privacy. It goes on to say that the federal government must improve its efforts to identify, deter, protect, against, detect, and respond to those threats and actions and actors. However, the executive order also calls out that cybersecurity requires more than just government action, and that protecting our nation from malicious cyber actors requires the federal government to partner with the private sector, and that the private sector must adapt to the continuously changing threat environment to ensure its products are built and operate securely, and to partner with the federal government to foster a more secure cyberspace. The order states that the federal government must adopt security best practices, advance towards zero-trust architecture, accelerate movement to secure cloud services, centralize and streamline access to security data to drive analytics for identifying and managing cybersecurity risks, and to invest in both technology and personnel to match the goals. The order also clearly states that the federal government shall develop a plan to implement zero-trust architecture, which shall incorporate, as appropriate, the mitigation steps that the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, has outlined in standards and guidance. The order also clearly states that all appropriate resources should be implemented and authorities taken to maximize the early detection of cybersecurity vulnerability and incidents.
One of the issues with Zero Trust has been agreeing on what exactly Zero Trust means to agencies looking to implement it. As Jay mentioned, NIST has provided crucial guidance to the federal government and the country by creating the 800-207 publication. My hope is the executive order will influence the federal government to implement Zero Trust and encourage coordination between the federal government, likely through DHS, who is tasked with securing the homeland, and providing that coordination with the private sector.
So now let's take a quick look at the NIST standards and guidance for Zero Trust architecture. The NIST standards and guidelines for Zero Trust architecture are called out in the NIST special publication 800-207, Zero Trust Architecture. In this publication, NIST defines a Zero Trust architecture, the tenets of a Zero Trust architecture, what it should or could comprise, how it can be deployed, and much, much more. The publication describes Zero Trust for enterprise security architects. It aids in the understanding of Zero Trust for civilian unclassified systems. And it offers a roadmap to migrate and deploy a Zero Trust architecture in an enterprise environment. In the publication, NIST states that Zero Trust is not a single architecture, but a set of principles that guide workflows, systems design, and operations to improve security. Zero Trust cannot be attained by simply implementing a wholesale rip and replace of current infrastructure. Instead, the guidelines encourage the incremental implementation of Zero Trust principles, changes in processes, and technological solutions to protect data and business functions by use case. NIST also is realistic in stating that most organizations will be running a hybrid Zero Trust architecture model with an existing perimeter-based approach while moving toward Zero Trust and further securing their existing or launching new secure business processes. Zero Trust, according to NIST, means that trust is never implicitly granted, but instead is continually assessed and evaluated. And a Zero Trust architecture is an end-to-end approach to resource and data security that encompasses identity, credentials, hosting environments, and infrastructure. NIST's goal for Zero Trust architecture is to prevent unauthorized access to data and services while making access control enforcement as granular as possible. The NIST guidelines for Zero Trust architecture distinctly call out that they are not just meant for use or adoption by U.S. federal government departments and agencies, but they're also meant to provide a road for migration to and deployment of a Zero Trust architecture for non-government enterprise environments. Many enterprises in critical or sensitive or even highly regulated industries follow or adopt the NIST guidelines partially or completely. And the NIST ZTA guidelines are not only adopted by U.S. government or U.S.-based companies, but have been and will continue to be followed and adopted as best practices by governments and organizations worldwide.
You're exactly right, Jay. The NIST 800-207 guidance is applicable to both the federal government and the private sector.
And while the White House's executive order specifically mandates the adoption of a zero trust architecture, among other security initiatives for federal government departments and agencies, the order also calls out that the private sector must adapt to the continuously changing threat environment, ensure its products are built and operate securely, and partner with the federal government to foster a more secure cyberspace. Based on the level and sophistication of recent attacks on critical infrastructure and supply chains, it behooves companies in the private sector to also investigate and potentially adopt the NIST Zero Trust Architecture published guidelines that the federal government is required to adopt.
Case in point, the Colonial Pipeline breach.
So what does NIST call out in their Zero Trust Architecture guidelines? NIST states that while a Zero Trust architecture is focused on protecting data and services, that protection should be expanded to include all enterprise assets. And that means including user devices, infrastructure, applications, virtual environments, and even cloud components. ZTA should also cover all subjects, which includes all users, including customers, contractors, and the like, applications, and even any other non-human entity requesting information from or access to resources. So that would also include device-to-device communications. According to NIST, what are the principles or tenets of zero trust? They include all data sources and computing services are considered resources. All communication must be made in the most secure manner available, regardless of network location. And that means that access requests from any device located on an enterprise-owned network infrastructure, even inside a network perimeter, must meet the same security requirements for access requests and communications as any other non-enterprise-owned network. Trust should never automatically be conferred based on a device being on an enterprise network. Access to individual resources is granted only on a per-request basis, with trust in the user requesting access evaluated and determined before granting access, and then only with least privileged access rights. Resource access is determined by dynamic policy, leveraging user identity and associated attributes, device integrity, network location, request time and date, behavioral analytics, and more, including the sensitivity of the resource or data to which access has been requested. And again, with least privileged principles applied restricting visibility and access. The enterprise should monitor and measure the integrity and security posture of all owned and associated devices and assets. It should establish continuous diagnostic and mitigation to monitor the state of devices and applications, and should apply patches and fixes as quickly as possible and as needed. Any asset that has been compromised with known vulnerabilities or is not enterprise managed can be treated differently than devices owned by or associated with an enterprise and that are deemed to be in a secure state. All resource authentication and authorization is dynamic and strictly enforced before access is allowed, and continually monitored with possible reauthentication and reauthorization that can occur. An enterprise implementing a ZTA should have an identity, credential, and access management and asset management system, have established the use of multi-factor authentication for access to some or all enterprise resources, and collection of as much information as possible and data as possible about the current state of assets, network infrastructure, and communications should be made, and then to use that information to improve their security posture. According to NIST Zero Trust Network View, an organization should always act as if an attacker is present on their network, and communication should always be done in the most secure manner available, including authenticating all connections and encrypting all traffic. Devices on a network may not be owned or configurable by the organization because visitors or contracted services may need network access to perform their role. Or BYOD, or bring your own device policies, could mean the use of non-enterprise-owned devices to access enterprise resources. Every asset must have its security posture evaluated before a request is granted to an enterprise-owned resource, and device posture should continue as long as the user's session lasts. So what comprises a NIST Zero Trust architecture? Well, there is a policy engine which uses the defined enterprise policy as well as input from external sources like threat intelligence services to grant, deny, or revoke resource access. That's paired with a policy administrator. While the policy engine makes and logs the access decisions, the policy administrator executes that decision. Is responsible for creating or shutting down the communication path between a user and the resource, generating any censorship-specific authentication and authorization token or credential used by a client to access an enterprise resource. It's closely tied to the policy engine and relies on its decision to ultimately allow or deny access. The policy admin communicates with a policy enforcement point when creating the communication path, which is done via the control plane. The policy engine and policy administrator can be a single service. Now, the policy enforcement point, or PEP, enables monitors and eventually terminates the connection between a user and enterprise resource, like an application or any other resource. The PEP communicates with the policy admin to forward requests and our policy updates. It can be a single logical component in a zero-trust architecture, but it may be divided into two different components: a client, like an agent on a laptop, and a resource side, such as a gateway component in front of a resource that controls access. Or it may be a single portal that acts as a gatekeeper. Beyond the policy enforcement point is the trust zone hosting the resources. These components may be operated as an on-premises service or through a cloud-based service. So it doesn't necessarily mean zero trust has to be all cloud-based. There are additional data sources that can provide input and policy rules to be used as a policy engine when making access decisions, like an earlier mentioned CDM system.
I would like to touch on the CDM program. CDM stands for Continuous Diagnostics and Monitoring. Time will tell, but I see this as a big part of how the federal government will provide security data that can be acted on by the private sector. CDM has been an initiative to get the appropriate security data to a central location across all federal agencies so that it can be viewed and acted upon.
An organization will also need an industry compliance system to ensure compliance with regulatory requirements that the enterprise may need to adhere to. They will also need to include threat intelligence feeds, network and system activity logs, data access policies, enterprise PKI for generating and logging certificates issued by the enterprise to resources, users, services, and applications, an identity management system responsible for creating, strong, and storing and managing enterprise user accounts and identity records, and security information and event management or SIM systems. When migrating to a zero-trust architecture, particularly if it's going to be a hybrid ZTA environment that leverages existing security infrastructure and adds specific components, the NIST guidelines suggest identifying all users, even non-human entities, that may request access to specific data and resources. The next step is to identify enterprise-owned assets. Now, NIST realizes it may not be possible to identify all enterprise-owned assets, so if possible, a process or system should be implemented that quickly identifies, categorizes, and assesses newly discovered assets on any enterprise-owned infrastructure. It also states that all appropriate resources should be implemented and authorities taken to maximize the early detection of cybersecurity vulnerabilities and incidents, and that a plan to implement zero-trust architecture that incorporates the standards and guidance outlined by NIST be made. The NIST guidelines for zero-trust architecture is an organization's cybersecurity plan that utilizes zero-trust concepts and encompasses component relationships, workflow planning, and access policies. And NIST guidelines are not just meant for use or adoption by U.S. federal government departments and agencies, but also a guide for any organization in any industry, and not just in the U.S., to migrate to and deploy a zero-trust architecture for their environment. Both Ryan and myself thank you for viewing our session. We hope that we've been able to provide you with some insight into the recent executive order on improving cybersecurity from the White House, and how it addresses and suggests zero trust be used. And additionally, some insight and information into the NIST Special Publication 800-207 that the White House's executive order directed to be followed as guidance for implementing and selecting a zero-trust architecture. Please feel free to reach out to me, jkelly at j.kelly@f5.com with any questions. And for more information, please visit f5.com or contact an F5 representative or your channel representative. Thank you again.